says death to America and all that sort of thing?
Yeah, death to Americans and the temporary council.
Being a history buff, in order to attempt to understand things, I like to go back to beginnings. But in this case, let's just go back as far as my parents. Here is my dad in the 1950s. He has just survived the Korean War. His favorite role model is James Dean, and he has just recently married my mom, who is happy to have left her dirt poor parents' home, complete with an abusive, alcoholic father. We were all raised with certain expectations about family, success, and life that were so ingrained that they were normally not thought of consciously, but assumed. In the case of my family, as in many others in America in the 60s and beyond, we were in for some rude awakenings. For some reason, oil has been an important part of our lives, whether we wanted it to or not.
Fill up with Esso Extra and go!
My dad worked for Esso, which later became Exxon. He worked with seismographic crews who blew holes in the ground to look for oil. One result of this job is that we moved to the Middle Eastern country of Libya for 2 years. I was only 7 at the time, and I had little to prepare me for this desert country. There was a monarchy in charge, a King Idris, but because of the Cold War, ambitious people like Colonel Gaddafi saw a way to take power. It was in this time of shifting power and resources that we lived in the ancient city of Tripoli. We lived in 3 stone villas or large houses. Unfortunately, every time we moved into one, the landlord would raise the rent on these rich Americans. So my father, being stubborn, would move. Finally, in the 3rd villa that we lived in, it was at a great price, but literally in the shadow of Tripoli prison. It was this house that my mother first attempted suicide, and where, at 8 years old, I witnessed the presence of a ghost, and where, at 6 a.m. every morning, King Idris had his enemies of the state executed by firing squad. You can see here, by the circles under my eyes, how this affected us. I remember trying to beat this 3rd world alarm clock by getting up before the bang. I remember standing at the bathroom mirror, staring into my own eyes, trying unsuccessfully to concentrate on washing my face, waiting. When the report went off, I jumped, even though I knew within seconds when the rifles would fire. The amazing thing to me was that the Americans there tried to live a normal, middle-class life. For the most part, we did, except for us kids. There was an undeclared war between us and the Arab children. We had rock fights with them constantly, as they would not fight hand to hand. There were bloody casualties, but children seemed able to shake off a lot. And yet, over the course of 2 years, this was taking a toll. We knew we were at war, and we started to hate the Arabs as much as they hated us. As fate would have it, when we left Libya, we moved to New Orleans, Louisiana, or more exactly, Metairie. Now, we were finally in the normal suburbia that we pretended that we were in before. Well, perhaps normalcy is a myth, but at least things seemed stable. That is, until Hurricane Betsy hit. In the Gulf South, everyone seems to have a favorite worst hurricane. For me, it was this one for many years. It killed over 90 people, mostly in the St. Bernard area that flooded, and it almost killed me. I don't know if that storm was some sort of cathartic trigger, but soon after, my parents divorced. The family began its slow evaporation that in just a few years would leave precious little of what was before. A part of this dissolution was the Vietnam War. My father re-enlisted and went off to this new adventure. My brother and I enlisted also when we were old enough too. For me, it was mostly about money for college, though now when I look back, a sense of validation, a real need to prove myself was a strong undercurrent. How do I know this? Look at the unit I joined, the 82nd Airborne Paratroops. Fortunately, there were no wars to fight, though I did have a parachute fail on my 9th jump. Those are the reserve corps in the foreground. You could call me lucky, or a fool with a camera. At the end of 3 years, disgusted with the regimentation of the military, I got out. But little did I know at the time, this was the beginning of a long love-hate relationship with the military. I would join National Guard units for a tour, then get out. Oh, they'd let me back in when I wanted back in, but never with an advance in rank. The result, Alan Marsh, the world's oldest corporal. In the 90s, I spent 5 odd years with the Louisiana's 256 Tiger Brigade. During that time, I became a forward observer for an artillery unit and a cavalry scout for an infantry unit. But later, perhaps feeling my age, just a little, I joined a public affairs team. Here, my primary tool was a camera, not a weapon. In 2005, my captain asked me, "Would you like to go on a mission to Iraq?" "For how long?" I asked. She said, "1 month." "Sure," I said, figuring that the law of averages in combat in 1 month would be on my side, though I stupidly forgot that in the Army, 1 month could be much longer than 30 days. It turned out to be 67 days, but still I was lucky. The 256 Tiger Brigade that I was supposed to visit was on an 18-month deployment. So here I was, going to combat at an age when most guys just settled deeper into their lazy boy recliners and watched the History Channel. Our base was called Camp Liberty, and it was absolutely surreal. Everyone carried a weapon at all times, while a tethered balloon carried a camera to monitor activities in the camp and at the gates. 2 Black Hawk helicopters made several trips a day to bring people in and out of camp. Convoys were constantly leaving and returning from patrols in Baghdad. I also found out that Camp Liberty had another name. It was called a FOB. A FOB is an acronym for a forward operating base. I also learned about the Fobbit. The Fobbit was like a hobbit, which is an earth-dwelling creature. In other words, there were 2 kinds of soldiers. Ones who went out the wire into Baghdad, and then there were the lowly, despicable Fobbits. In truth, while the Fobbits were outwardly despised, I'm sure they were secretly envied.
Load up. Everybody load up.
Determined to not be publicly castigated, I went out on several missions. The first group I went out with was a scout platoon. The lieutenant in charge told me we were going on a presence patrol. I didn't know what that meant, so not wanting to appear clueless as perhaps like a Fobbit, I didn't ask. The first time out the wire, I was pretty keyed up, and was suddenly glad to have my bulky rifle and hot body armor. But really, what made me feel the most reassured was how these guys carried themselves. Here's Sergeant Roy. He's definitely the alpha male in charge here. Talk about an embodiment of confidence. There's Edwards, the driver, who the Sarge sometimes calls Mother. And there's the gunner, twisting his .50 caliber machine gun, left, then right. As I rode with these guys, I slowly learned over a course of days that they had all been wounded before. Not only that, there were ghosts sitting with us, because everyone here had lost a friend on patrol, either through gunfights or roadside bombs called IEDs, or VBEDs, vehicle-borne bombs driven by Iraqis intent on carrying us away with them into eternity. Edwards was quite a character. He was one of the first men I interviewed back at the camp and one of the first to openly cry for his lost brothers. In fact, several of the men I interviewed wept openly, and one was a company commander who was so grateful that he didn't have any deaths, wept too. Anyway, Edwards knew that a sense of humor is vital for survival. Here's a couple of skits that he and the other scouts put together.
Sergeant, come here. It's urgent. What do you got? An IED? A bomb? What? No. It's really urgent. Good job, Private.
Urgent cola. It's like an explosion in your mouth. For the insurgent in you.
Where's that resupply? 5 for 1, 5 for 1. This is Snickers 4. We need immediate Class 1 resupply. Over. Yeah! Right! Yeah! All right. Break it open, break it open.
Urgent cola. Anytime, anywhere. For the insurgent in you.
Another lesson in humor occurred one day when I went out the wire with Alpha Company. On this day, they were conducting what is called dismounted patrols. In other words, we would drive into Baghdad, park, and walk. On our long stroll, we visited, or rather invaded, a strip mall. Our masked interpreter, who we call Frank, bought himself a carton of cigarettes, while some of the guys bought a big bag of bread for just $1. Then, the last place we looked into was a video arcade. When we first went in, we had to let our eyes adjust to the dim light. But what caused me and the other soldiers to do a double take was the sheepish expressions the kids had as they looked back at us. It was then that we realized that the children were playing video games that taught them how to kill American soldiers. At first I was shocked. I felt a whole range of emotions, anger included. But then, me and the other guys just laughed. What else was there to do? The kids, relieved I guess, laughed too. And we went on our way. Another group I went out with was the 1088th Engineers. But they weren't building much these days. They were hunting insurgents while the insurgents hunted us. We had great fun looking for a bed factory within a carpet factory. We didn't find one, but that didn't mean it wasn't there. I found that the people like the camera, but to record history, it really can become problematic. I found that people generally either act up for a camera or clam up. So, I learned to turn off the red record indicator light and hold it down low. Eventually, everyone forgets about it as they assume it is off, just like another piece of equipment that a soldier has to haul around. On the ride back in an armored track, I had the camera on this guy. He kept looking up. I finally figured out he was looking for the wire, that imaginary line denoting when we were back in the camp and relatively safe. On another occasion, I went out with the scouts again, and it suddenly occurred to me what Presence Patrol meant. Here are the Americans. You want to fight? Go ahead. Soon after, I went out the wire with the tankers to Route Irish. On this patrol, we found a civilian who was murdered on the highway. We wanted to try and help him, but the lieutenant was afraid he might be wired to explode. He told his guys to get back in their tank. The lieutenant knew that there were smart guys on both sides who, during sleepless nights, stared at their ceilings in the dark, not really seeing it, who thought hard about new and inventive ways to thoroughly and permanently mess over the other guy. But on this occasion, the violence was the ever-increasing Iraqi on Iraqi kind. Some believe that this is the start of what they call opening the gates of hell. In other words, their civil war. But I noticed that as the lieutenant kept telling me to keep my head down, I kept finding excuses to go up top. I also noticed that the other guys did too, and I figured that the heat made us all claustrophobic to some degree. though on May 17th, 2 other tankers were killed by a sniper. Initially, there was a lot of confusion as to how these guys died. Rumors were everywhere. A spray of AK-47 fire, many people said. But I found out that one guy was hit in the neck and the other one who tried to help his buddy was hit in the side. This wasn't a spray, this was precise. This was the work of a sniper. At first I wanted to know who tried to help who, but then it occurred to me, it didn't matter. They were brothers. While the Fobbits were treated as cowards, it really wasn't that safe in the camp. On occasion, powerful rockets and mortars would slam inside while we hoped that the blast walls we put everywhere would help. One day I went to Tiger Plaza, a little home away from home with little gazebos, a PX, and even a burger joint. It seemed safe there, but you had to try and ignore the fact that we were all armed for a reason and that Telegraph Hill just behind us was a great target reference point for the enemy. A few days after I left, this happened. The next morning, sitting in my hooch, I hear another explosion. I ran outside and saw that it was our Paladin cannons that were firing out the wire. I walked over and asked one of the cannoneers what was going on. He said, firing tables, which means firing practice. So I walk over to another guy and ask the same question. He says, area denial, which is really not firing practice. So, a little confused, I walk away and see enemy mortars hitting less than 100 meters from the cannons. It occurs to me that part of the war experience is that few people, if anyone, really knows what's going on. We would assume that the enemy would have a self-knowledge about what their people were doing at all times, and that the Americans would too. However, your own people can be attacked 3 or 4 blocks away, and if they're not in your unit, you might not even hear about it until you read it in the Stars and Stripes newspaper the next day in the mess hall. While the generals might know what's going on, the soldiers on the ground often do not. This is what I would call the fog of war. On one of my last missions, I sat in the back with a medic. I didn't catch his name, but I remember he kept calling me brother. Normally, I would find this annoying. I think words like brother and love are often misused, implying a connection that is not really there. But this guy made it clear that anyone who went out the wire with him was his brother. And for the next few hours, we were brothers, all of us, the whole platoon. It suddenly came to me why I was even on this mission. When I was 20, I would have deceived myself into believing that it was to validate myself by combat. But now that I'm older, I knew it was something else. It was for the brotherhood, the familial connection, the family that I had missed. On May 28, 2005, the stuff really did hit the fan. It had been 1 month since the new Iraqi council had been elected, and I guess the insurgents wanted to remind us of their displeasure. 2 suicide bombers blew themselves up at 2 different gates. Firefights were everywhere. One of our jets flew overhead looking for targets. What really bothered me is that this was the day I gave up my weapon as we were about to ship out. That night they hit Temple Gate again with RPGs and heavy machine guns. And here I am, armed with a camera.
Oh look, tracers.
On June 3rd, me and 2 guys I'm with go to Baghdad Airport. At first, we can't believe our luck as there will only be 5 passengers, meaning we will not be packed in like sardines in a can. But as soon as we take off, a missile alarm goes off and the plane dives, shoots out flares, and we hang on. Eventually, the pilots believe we are safe, sort of, and level off. There, I've cheated death again. I go home, and my father dies. Back in the States, everyone wanted to know how it was. I really don't know what to say. On one hand, it was like being in a movie, like Libya was. But if you start believing it and let your guard down, look out. On the other hand, most of the Iraqis I saw were just like us, and that they were only trying to get through their day with as little fuss as possible. And our guys, I was proud to stand with them. They were trying to do an enormously difficult job in horrible conditions. I'm only back a couple of weeks, and I look at a newspaper and see where one of our guys in the 1088 that's been killed. Tears fill my eyes, and this surprises me. I check out the name, and sure enough, he's in the 1088. We searched the carpet factory together. So I'm trying to adjust. Most people agree that 67 days in a war zone is not that big a deal. However, on July 3rd, I'm at a fireworks show. As the fireworks reach their crescendo, I find that I want them to stop, and I want them to stop now. This astonishes me. On August 27, 2005, my company commander calls me and informs me we've been activated for hurricane duty. Drama queens, I say. How bad can it be? A hurricane out in the Gulf? Now, you want to know a hurricane? Hurricane Betsy. That was a hurricane. So, they have me and hundreds of other guardsmen drive to New Orleans, specifically to Jackson Barracks, which will soon be the next Atlantis. There, they have me pack up a camera and get in a van and go to Lafayette. The logic there was, if I'm not part of the tragedy, I'll be able to help more later. Drama queens, I think to myself. Well, I've been wrong once or twice in my life, and this was certainly an occasion. 2 days after the storm hit, they had me sign out an old Humvee and lead a convoy of military and media to our new headquarters in Belle Chase. On the way, though, we took a diversion into New Orleans. Talk about deja vu. I felt like I was back in Baghdad. Only this might have been worse. There were helicopters flying everywhere like giant predatory insects. Fires were raging, huge sections of the city were flooded, gangs, our soon-to-be equivalent to insurgents, were getting geared up, and then there were the civilians, people scared out of their minds who underestimated this storm like I did. The only real difference I could see was that in Baghdad, the insurgents were much more organized. There was a sophistication in their killing that the looters still lacked. Once we were set up in Belle Chase, one of my colonels informed me my job was to escort media out the wire into New Orleans and to take video. I was to either beg helicopter rides or use my Humvee. I was to make sure that neither the media nor myself was to get killed, so everyone would be happy. They signed me out a 9mm service pistol and set me loose. During the start of this, we go to the Causeway Bridge in Metairie. This is where refugees swim and walk to be bussed out towards Baton Rouge, Houston, and points beyond. This was also a helicopter drop-off area where people rescued from rooftops are flown in. I'm standing there trying to soak all this in when at my feet, an old woman in a wheelchair starts talking to me. I bend down closer to hear. She says, "Do you know Schumacher?" I look at her and I think she is either senile or delirious from thirst or both. Then I look at the Yorkie, probably just as old as she is in dog years, tied to her wheelchair. Something is wrong with this leash and he's strangling. I quit filming long enough to help the little guy and realize that he's thirsty too. I get him some water, but he seems too far gone to drink. I realize I can't do anything for either of them, and this bothers me. Later in the city, I see this guy carrying his little dog in a baby carrier. I'll bet this is not easy, carrying that weight for hours on end. But this guy is not about to abandon his dog. I could see it in his face, the defiance in his eyes, the set of his jaw. I can't help him either, but if it's any consolation, he has my admiration. Many people were forced to abandon their pets in order to get rides out of the city, as rescuers were told not to accept pets in order to get as many people out in the shortest amount of time. And the pet owners who did not abandon their friends, well, rational people could reasonably accuse them of excessive sentimentality. But I say, true loyalty is never convenient. After several days, I start to bug Lieutenant Cagney about going to the zoo. I don't know who thought it up first, but it seems a newsworthy idea. We finally arrive at Audubon, and the Oklahoma Guard is already there protecting it. We find the curator head guy, a Daniel something. He's a pleasant guy and seems to be holding up well under the strain of no electricity, limited water, and significant wind damage. It seems that he and a skeleton crew stayed during the storm. Just when we get to the gate to go in, an Israeli news crew drives up. They too want to see the animals. But before we go in, they ask, "Are there many bodies?" "No," Daniel replies. Within a minute, they get back in their news van and drive off. I guess dead bodies sell. As they drive off, I look after them with self-righteous derision. Imagine that. These clowns travel halfway across the world to view others' misfortune. But wait, isn't that what I did in Baghdad? But that was different, wasn't it? I now have two dominant emotions about Baghdad. I feel both guilty and proud. I feel guilty because in order for me to have my big adventure, there had to be high stakes. In other words, people had to die. But then again, I feel proud also because I too stood on the streets of Baghdad ready to die. I suppose this is some kind of survivor's guilt. But now the feeling of being back in Baghdad is really intense, but not as an American. I'm starting to feel like an Iraqi. You know, those poor people that I previously pitied and was sure I left back in Iraq. But now, in just a couple of months, I am them. I'm living in a third world country. It also occurs to me that wars are everywhere. There are big wars that make the news and are billed as wars, but then there are little wars. There doesn't really need to be guns and bombs to conduct one. All that is required is to have two or more people who are willing to compete for a perceived resource. That's all. After almost a year, I'm sent back to New Orleans as the mayor claims he needs the National Guard to help maintain order as the city is still in a bad way. Up front, I say to myself, drama queen. But as I ride out with the military police, I can see where he's coming from. There seems to be islands of the city that are coming back, though most of these islands were places that were not badly flooded. But the rest is still in ruins. As we ride through, I'm drawn to the markers on the houses. The bottom marker is for bodies found, and I see where many people and many pets left behind perished. Another sight that surprises me, though it shouldn't, are the tourists. No, not the Bourbon Street Mardi Gras tourist, but the people who came to see the ruins. This reminds me of touring the Roman ruins in Libya. It is darkly fascinating to see how the mighty have fallen. I found Baghdad and New Orleans to be both strange, amazing, a horror, and yet beautiful too. I suppose these cities and times were mostly surreal, a combination of the fantastic coupled with the familiar. Oddly, the main thing that kept me grounded in reality was the heat, an ever-present reminder that I was not watching a movie. But these were just settings. What was important to me was how people reacted. These were hard times. Going through these terrible times, I feel there must be a lesson, but am I quick enough to get it? I saw my dad a year before he died, and he had some surprises of his own. He was a veteran of the Korean and Vietnamese wars, Hurricane Betsy, and a 20-year police officer for Houston. I guess you could say he was a badass. He wasn't the best dad in the world, but during his last years, I think his epiphany was his mortality and how he was going to deal with it. Drawing to a close his own Presence Patrol, my dad tried hard to make up to me his previous neglect and occasional cruelties. That's the thing about age and mortality. It strips away the worldly cares. It shows us that possessions are like masks, hiding what is truly important. He finally realized, though late, that what is important is to love those around us. And can you guess what he was most proud of his service in Korea, Vietnam, and as a 20-year policeman? The last time I saw him, he said, "I never had to kill anybody." He said this so reverently as he showed me his old service slides and photos and medals. I never had to kill anyone. I feel like there is some sort of large-scale cosmic lesson here, but am I subtle enough, smart enough to get it, to pass? It seems that we spend our lives competing for resources, engaging in wars big and small. This is the way of the world. Yet within each of us there is a notion that there could be something else, a transcendence to something higher, something better.